We have stories from the early church of people being ordained 2 or 3 days after a bishop decides to do it. I think whoever preached that sermon, Bishop, can we fire up an ordination day after tomorrow? All right. Might have overpromised on the conversion bit. We'll see. But I do love being here in a camp setting. It's perfect. A rabbi friend of mine says you can ask any Jewish rabbi where they went to Jewish camp. Not whether they went to Jewish camp, where they went to Jewish camp. Camps are our training grounds for leadership. It's weird, for all the work you and I pour into Sunday mornings, trying to get everything just right, someone has to go away into the woods with sports and sweat and bugs and inadequate plumbing to meet Jesus and have their life changed. I don't know how to explain that. One strange move that we mainline Protestants tried to make was to have our faith without all that teenage sentimentality, without going off into the wild, getting to hold someone's hand, crying on the last night, promising to be best friends forever, and then forgetting the person's name a few weeks later. I just don't think you can have Christianity without all that, super rational stuff. You can't have it without all that below-the-neck stuff. Don't try and drain the emotion and sentimentality out of faith. It's a failing proposition. Camps. All right, I may as well tell some of this story. So the camp I grew up at was a Southern Baptist camp. And my parents sent me there because they didn't have religious stuff to give me, and they thought they could outsource it to someone else. But they didn't know enough to vet, the kind of camp. And so they just, good, religion, off you go. And they were the kind of Baptists who use the rapture to scare you out of hell a little too much. So I can't send my kids there, but I kind of regret that because I'm really glad I had that. A friend of mine who studies evangelicals said there will always be liberal churches because evangelicals will convert people and then disaffect them, and they'll backpedal into liberal churches. So he says, don't worry, you guys have a future. Now, I worked at another camp that had more money, a little bit more country club feel to it, and I remember asking them one time, so have we ever had African-American kids at this camp? And they said, I don't know. And I thought, there's your answer. Now, the camp I had gone to were the kind of Baptists who want to go get the people that no one else is caring for. And so from the beginning, they had had a week for prisoners' kids for free. And so they had never been segregated. Now, they didn't start out saying, let's have a camp for racial reconciliation. They said, let's go find the people Jesus loves and no one else is loving. Give us them. We'll pay for them to come here. So they got to a thing we liberals care about, justice, reconciliation, etc., by being passionate about pursuing the people Jesus is after. So there's that. And they converted me, and I backpedaled into a mainline denomination eventually. Now, you'll notice I don't really trust abstract principles. I'm not into, giving guidelines, do this or that or whatever. I tell stories. And some of that's because I'm a Southerner, like y'all. But it's also because I know that what works in one place won't work in another place. So I go to specific places, like the north of England, and I tell stories from that place so that you can hear it from your specific place. You can notice what's working there, and then take that back to your particularity and see what might work in your place. Stories are better than principles. But I have one principle. I'm going to give it to you now. It's not abstract. It comes right from these stories. Try something. Experiment. Fail. Learn. Try again. Better this time. So an evangelical sociologist told me one time, this is the difference between the mainline and evangelicals and how they start things. Evangelicals start 100 things, and they underfund all of them. And then they notice the 10 that succeed, and then they dump money on those 10. 3 or 4 of those succeed long term. The success rate is pretty low, 3 or 4%. But because they don't spend all their money at the beginning, those things that are going to actually live get funded. They spend it wisely. Meanwhile, this sociologist says, we mainline liberals do something else. We start one thing, and we lavishly fund it. And then when it fails, we say, oh, well, that never works. We tried it, and we can't ever try anything again. Plus, we spent all the money. You see the difference? Now, our professionalism in the main line might hurt us here. It's really, really expensive to pay for a full-time clergy person. Now, a lot of that money doesn't come to us. We got seminary costs, seminary debt, we need master's degrees, years and years of vetting. There's pensions that are always wobbly. We got overpriced, although y'all's is better than mine. Anyway, we got, I've done the research. We've got overpriced health insurance here in this country. We don't have that in Canada. We got space. Y'all come see us. But if you start something led by lay people, that's much cheaper. Pay them a little bit, and it's a lot to them because they got a day job or they're retired or whatever. And then they're doing it out of love for ministry rather than for a paycheck. I told a friend in the UK about a new Holy Trinity Brompton-style church that was going into a city in the north. They had already hired 4 full-time clergy. 4. And he did the math, and he said, I could start 50 Fresh Expressions with that money. Because Fresh Expressions are led by lay people. It's way cheaper to do ministry that way. Somewhere John Wesley is smiling, I think, about that. Most of those 50 Fresh Expressions will fail. 10 will succeed. And there'll be strong new cells of church life. So I point to this research in my book, Northern Lights, that Bishop Glenda talked about yesterday. I'm a terrible capitalist. I have 1 copy of each of these. But they're all at jasonbyassee.com. They all have links to something other than Amazon where you can buy them. The research shows people are drawn to great big worship gatherings. More growth has happened in the Church of England through little bitty gatherings. Lots of little bitty gatherings have made the equivalent of 2 new dioceses in the Church of England. The media pays more attention to great big gatherings because they're good on film. But little bitty gatherings of people in coffee shops don't make good pictures, and so they don't show up in media. You see what I mean? You can actually grow bigger faster by getting smaller and multiplying the number of your gatherings. The Methodist revival lives. So that's my charge to y'all. Start something. And maybe not just one thing, but lots of underfunded things. Find your leaders whom folks are attracted to and put them in a place where they can invite their friends to pursue Jesus together. They're non-Christian, non-church friends. And count it as a success when there's a failure. I really think we have a low tolerance for failure in the main line. We should have awards at conferences like these for the diocese's best failure of the year, right? Most spectacular trip up that's embarrassing. Because unfortunately, as human beings, we seem to learn better and faster from failure than from success. We just need to praise that in church. So tell your people starting something, please expect this to fail. That takes the pressure off. See that? And then they can actually try something. As Christians, the heart of our faith is a failure. The cross means life for all. So failure is not failure with our God. And success is not success if there's not a cross right in the heart of it. That's what we mean by resurrection. So I want to tell you some stories from some of my other books. One is called Better Than Brunch. It's about missional churches in British Columbia and Washington and Oregon. And another is called 8 Virtues of Rapidly Growing Churches. These are about fast-growing Methodist churches. I co-wrote both of those. But before I get into those, I'm going to tell you a story from Toronto, my new home. I've only been in Toronto 6 months, and a wonderful Anglican parish with resources tells me they've inherited a building that's closed. Now, Toronto has some of the priciest real estate on God's green earth. And so you know what the temptation is. You just sell that, and then you can fund something else. Right? But someone wise said, no. Give it to the most ambitious parish so that they can restart it. Its rector asked me, how do I do that? So I told her how Holy Trinity Brompton, the Alpha Church, does that in London. They hire a future church planter. They have that person intern at HTB. They train them. And then they get sent to a closed church building and restart, not by themselves. They are sent with dozens of other people. It's not one person to start a church. Dozens of people are needed to do this. And these people will move house from, say, London to like Brighton, 2 hours away. They ask people to do that, and they will do it. Now, this amazes me. Can you imagine asking someone to move their whole life for their church? It makes perfect sense to us that someone would move for love or for work. But if someone told you they were moving because their church asked them to, you would think they were nuts. They'd join some kind of sect. It's the Church of England asking them to do this. HTBers will do it. Now, don't give them a halo just yet. Often these are young professionals. They've had their first kid or two, and now they want to buy property, which is not possible in London. And so moving 2 hours away fits their phase of life. It doesn't mean any less credit for them. The church is still making a big ask. I'm just saying people can slot it in to their stage of life. That's how you start something. You send away, as the mother church, dozens of your best people. Dozens of them. Not with one charismatic leader, but dozens. Now, you might say dozens of people is already a church and not just a plant, and you'd be correct. It takes a church to plant a church. Now, if you're the rector who's sending people, you're terrified. I can't afford to send dozens of my best people. I don't even have dozens of best peoples. But here's how it works. HTB reports that when people join their church, they already know joining it means they might be sent away for mission. That's part of the deal that's baked in. And they're up for it. And maybe our keen church leaders are like manna. If we try and keep them close, manna rots. If we give them away, more come. That's what HTB finds. The gap where dozens of their best people were gets filled in quickly with more keen people. Now, here's the other thing you can sometimes do. You can send dozens of people away for a short time. I want you to go and help start this thing, and then in a year's time, you can come back, right? That's another strategy. Sometimes they decide after a year they don't want to come back. But I'm told there's a church here in Birmingham that's done exactly this, restarting a closed Methodist church across town. My fellow writer in 8 Virtues of Rapidly Growing Churches, Matt Byassee, as a church planter in the Methodist system, he says his evangelical and Pentecostal friends are jealous of him because we got bishops and we got a machinery that can decide not to close a church or to give a building to some place that's growing. He says they can't believe we have this system that can help you plant and we don't use it. They're like, I would love if I could have a bishop and a machinery to help me get another building, but you guys have that and you don't use it. Once property's sold, you never get it back. Don't just sell it and turn it into cash. Richard Chartres, a bishop of London, spent years taking closing churches in the Church of England in London and giving them to Holy Trinity Brompton to restart. And then eventually, he was out of churches. And worship attendance in the Diocese of London actually ticked upward for the first time in 2 centuries. That's impressive. Chartres also says they find that rectors bear the most fruit in their church starting in year 12. You can't microwave this. It takes patience. Here's what you might not need: a charismatic person at the microphone. Again, we get obsessed with that because we have hero stories of some church in Southern California or some church in the Chicago suburbs with some dynamic person at the microphone. Don't believe them. Matt Byassee says we overfreight the importance of the person at the microphone. If you think about Nicky Gumbel at Holy Trinity Brompton, who started Alpha, he's not that good a speaker. So I sometimes say, I don't know if I like Alpha or not. Sometimes I don't like it very much, but God seems to like Alpha. Because where you find it at work, stuff is growing. One of the most interesting churches in Vancouver is pastored by a friend of mine who can't preach. I'm like, Dave, why are people coming to your church? He says, because we give out lattes. I don't know about you, but I'd pay $5 out of my church's budget to have someone drink a decent cup of coffee rather than the dark, bad liquid that we normally serve at church. Preaching is overrated when it comes to growing churches. It really is. What we underrate is the character of the person planting. Their dynamism is what gets us in trouble. Their character is what will build a community. You see the difference? Matt also says evangelical churches, when they're vetting a church planter, will act like the FBI. They'll talk to their friends in grade school. They'll talk to their ex-boyfriends and girlfriends. They'll talk to the teacher who gave them a bad grade in grade 12. He's like, in the main line, we see somebody charismatic and we're like, here's a church and too much money. No. Vet the character first. So in my book with Ross Lockhart, Better Than Brunch, we detail missional churches in places you wouldn't think of. Portland, Oregon is one of the least church-going cities in North America. Here in Alabama, you can ask a perfect stranger where they go to church. It's just like making small talk. You ask somebody that in Portland, and they're likely to throw their latte at you. It's a different place. I'm struck with the urgency with which missional folks lead in Portland. So one church, Portsmouth Union, is a Methodist Disciples of Christ joint congregation. They have property and they want to build housing for their vulnerable, homeless neighbors. And the city of Portland won't give them the permits. They have the money, they have the land, they have the builder lined up, and they're waiting on the government. When we walked in, the sanctuary was full of cots where their neighbors were sleeping in between Sundays. So Pastor Jules Nielsen says, our mayor calls housing an emergency. This is stupid. We have to house them. It's stupid, stupid, stupid. She sounds like a Republican railing against big government, right? Nope. She's a missional prophet advocating for her poor friends. She feels this urgency partly because of the urgency in her own soul. She has no time for bashing the church. She says this, I grew up in a people without forgiveness, with no span of time longer than your lifetime, where you got what you could without a sense of God's time or patience that comes from that. My faith community is bread to my soul, balm to my spirit, a light to my path. I've felt what captivity feels like, and any sacrifice I offer to the church tastes like freedom to me. If we talk like that again, people will notice. Church has saved her life, and now she wants to save lives of her homeless neighbors. So housing homeless people is urgent. The church's salvation is urgent. Missional churches in Cascadia think it's urgent to reach the next person, not optional. And it's not for church growth. It's not a way to stop mainline decline. That won't happen, by the way. We could start 1 billion of these churches and the mainline will keep going like this. The question is, what sort of church will emerge from the rubble after it's done? That's what we're aiming for, the next generation. Another pastor we interviewed from Portland, Ken Hood, keeps parishioners' photos on his desk, 2 of them, parishioners who have died. One is a man who was in his church every Sunday who took his own life. Ken wants to look at him while he gets ready for every sermon. Another's a little girl who died in an accident in their preschool. Every week, we preach to dying people. You've never preached to someone who's not dying. And I was amazed at the change in my preaching when I thought, all right, let's pretend I'm getting hit by a bus Monday. What am I going to say to them Sunday? What's the last word of mine I want ringing in their ears? Here's the thing, you won't run out of stuff. If you spend everything you got and hold nothing back, God will bless you with more to say, okay? Sam Wells, you guys had here a year ago, points out that our churches were designed when the goal of the Christian life was to avoid hell. That was the goal. Then somewhere around 1850, without issuing a press release, we decided we weren't worried about hell anymore. It's not that we had some theological decision that it wasn't a thing. We just started acting like it wasn't a thing. It was a silent dawning. And this system of parish churches we have that are great for avoiding hell isn't so great for whatever we're trying to do now. What are we trying to do now? But here's the thing about avoiding hell. It's urgent. Whatever we're trying to do now is not as urgent. I would like to say we could have more urgency from the resurrection of Jesus than we ever had from worrying about the afterlife. You see the difference there? I'm going to switch to my Methodists. My Methodists are a revivalist sect. That's why Methodism exists. Someone said Methodism is an Anglican prayer meeting that got out of hand. I think that's great. We accidentally broke off from you guys because we wanted to preach revivals. And you guys thought, nah. I mean, who can blame you? Revivals are gross, right? Methodist revivals had perfectly respectable people rolling around in the dirt, barking like dogs, laughing hysterically, dancing in the dark. It's undignified. I'd kick them out too, right? Off you go. Now we Methodists are just as post-respectable as you guys are. Methodists haven't converted anybody in years. That's not a problem for y'all, but it's a problem for us. If you're a revivalist sect and you're not reviving anybody, what do you exist for? It's a good question to ask yourselves, what do we exist for? Why does God need our church? Because then that informs everything else you do in ministry. Two of the churches in Better Than Brunch were gifted with free buildings. Quest Church in Seattle first rented from a congregation called Inner Bay Covenant. This is an aging white congregation from a Swedish denomination. And their renter, Quest, is a multi-ethnic, justice-hungry evangelical church. So Quest grew, Inner Bay declined, and eventually the old Swedes said, what if we just give you all the building? I mean, you're reaching our changed neighborhood. We haven't been able to reach it in generations. And they did. How many more, they thought, can you reach if you're not paying us rent? So the two churches merged, and Quest paid nothing. Now, lots of mainline churches survive by selling off bits of property and land. But that property was once gifted to reach people for Christ. Just turning it into condos is a loss. If we can't reach people anymore, let's give the building to someone who can. Same story, Tapestry Church in Vancouver, rented from Dutch Calvinists. That old church realized that TAP was reaching folks they couldn't, mostly young people from Asia's diaspora. And so they gave them their building. And now Tapestry worships in 4 sites across Metro Vancouver. When they plant a new site, they say to everyone who lives near that site, we don't want to see you at the mother church anymore. We need you at this mission outpost near where you live. Now you feel the urgency in that, right? And it's not about propping up a denomination. It's about mission. One way, again, to think about the urgency is to think about death. Matthew Tate pastors an Orthodox church that's growing in Portland. You know, the real Orthodox, the one with the beards and the chanting and the candles and stuff. In his ministry, he says, if you watch Jesus and death, Jesus rushes toward death, goes right toward it, and then raises the dead. Jesus is not afraid of death. He moves toward it. For the Orthodox, Tate says, Jesus is rushing straight toward hell. Why is he on his way to hell? Some say he's looking everywhere for his lost friend Judas. I love that. For the Orthodox, in icons of Jesus in hell, he's broken down the door of hell and he's lifting out Adam and Eve. Humanity's being raised. We're in a hurry out of fear of death, but we should fear more the one who raises the dead. Church is always hyper-local. That's why I tell stories. If a story from one local helps you in your local, it's a good story. So, I want to tell you something you won't believe. There's a church in Seattle that has no sign out front. No indication it's a Christian church at all. Now, this can be a little bit of a flex. The best brunch place in my neighborhood in Toronto also has no sign. They don't need a sign. They got chicken and waffles. People will line up for 2 hours with no sign. There's something to that. The food's that good. Ken Hood says, if you're going to lead a church in the Pacific Northwest, it's going to have to be better than brunch. That's where we got the title for the book. And that's really hard, because brunch is pretty damn great. I mean, you really want to compete with that? South Lake Union Church is in the neighborhood that Amazon has taken over in Seattle and blown up big. They're the ones with no sign. What they have instead is a chocolate shop. Seattle has enough coffee bars. Seattle invented the coffee bar. No more coffee stuff. This oversaturated market. What this neighborhood didn't have was craft chocolate. You know, the kind that costs too much and they've certified that it wasn't farmed by slave labor. Nestle won't do that. And the kind that you have to pay through your nose for. So this church, South Lake Union, also has venue space. Chocolate shop in the front, gathering space in the back. Now, they meet there twice a month for church, but on the 2 other Sundays, they don't meet for church. They're out in their neighborhood doing service. But in Amazon's neighborhood, what do people not have? Gathering space. If you work for the Borg, for the Death Star, for Amazon, you have no space in your life. So lots of these tech employees trained in India come to Seattle, buy the smallest condo that they can afford, go down the elevator, go to Amazon, up the elevator, come home, go down the elevator. They have no space in their life, right? And that can be crushingly lonely. This church has space and gives it away for concerts and parties and bar mitzvahs in a corner of that city where space is a premium. And then they'll serve you the best chocolate you ever had. Who needs a church sign? That would work against you. No one wants to go to church in the Pacific Northwest. What you need is better chocolate. Now, I love stories where what you're trying to do is not compete with the Presbyterians, right? Like, it's a different world out there. Hyper local. Here's the point. Church has to know its space, its place in granular detail. We have to pray for the peace of our Jerusalem. I serve a church like lots of y'all's in Toronto, more English than the king. We don't have a Canadian maple leaf flag in our sanctuary. We have a Union Jack. Some other country. No one's had the heart yet to take Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip and their photos down. It's like everyone's waiting for someone else to do it, right? We look more like Canterbury at my place than we look like some of Toronto's nicknames. Toronto the Good, Hogtown, Dirty Little York. You get my point. But in the Church Catholic, small c, saints hallow a place, a new place. Mother Teresa is of Calcutta, not of her home in Albania. Calcutta is hallowed by her ministry there. You see that? Katere Tekakwitha, it's the same with her in Mohawk territory. You all have the martyrs of Alabama. Alabama is different because of their blood in this ground. In our faith, God gets born in Bethlehem and crucified in Jerusalem, but the Holy Spirit raises up new images of Jesus in Jasper or Gadsden or whatever county seat town y'all serve in. It's a real problem in Toronto that I live in a different neighborhood than my church. I really worry about this. Now, no one can live where my church is. It's too expensive, right? But this is something that rural and small town ministry has right. You want to shop where your folks are, where you'll bump into them at the grocery store. You want to go to the local football games, hear the local gossip, speak with the local accent, or have them make fun of your accent with their local ones, right? In Northern Lights, I point to an old Anglican tradition of going to your bishop and saying, "Bishop, send me wherever no one wants to go." Wherever. Now that runs aground against family, against education, against your spouse's profession. There's a reason we don't do that. I have never said this to any bishop. I will only say this to bishops who aren't my bishop in the room. I'm just saying it's something y'all should do. But you see why lots of churches ask people to be celibate if they're going to be priests, right? It makes all of that easier. It's a little late for most of us now, I realize. In the early church, folks flooded into the desert, looking for more and more obscure places in which to disappear into prayer. And lots of our greatest saints are from places, even people at the time were like, "Where's that? Hippo?" No one knew where Hippo was. Nazianzus? People made fun of Gregory from being from Nazianzus. None of these places are too small for the God of small things. Now, I'm going to give you one more church in Vancouver. It's called Grandview Calvary Baptist. It's on the Drive in East Van. It's one of the coolest, hippest neighborhoods in the world and the most church-allergic place in this most church-allergic city. This is where Vancouver keeps its grit, not its glamour. None of you has been to the Drive because they skip it on all the cruise tours that come through Vancouver. And this church was going to close. My Methodist church has closed. It's a beautiful old Methodist church with like a seating in the round. It's like a revival tent that they made into a building. It's a wonderful theater. Like, closed churches make really good spaces for other things. They make really cool nightclubs. They make really cool climbing wall places. Like, closed churches are dope, right? So my Methodist closed. The Baptists had decided to close, but they didn't tell my friend when they hired him, hey, guess what? We decided to close. They just hired him. And so he gets there, and the Sunday school rooms are filled with garbage, and someone tells him, oh, wait, we shouldn't have hired you. We're closing. It was that bad. Now, he had read it would take 10 years to get healthy. And in his youthful arrogance, he thought, nah, we'll do it faster. And he looked back at year 10 and said, oh, yeah, that's how long it takes. They started a ministry with their old heads, meeting with young moms in the neighborhood, helping them learn mothering. They'd all come from broken families, and they didn't know how to mother. Anybody else got old ladies in your church that know how to mother? Like, is that a resource you got? I thought you might have a few of those. They ministered in the local coin laundromat with food and coins and kindness. That's a place everybody who's blue-collar, middle class, and below has to go. The fact that I don't even know where the nearest coin laundromat is to my house shows I'm not with Jesus' closest friends. You see that? Go find them. They're there. They did this thing. They would rent out the local barbershop for the day so that all their homeless friends could go get their hair cut. Isn't that good? And folks started to notice. So Vancouver's grit, in one of the least religious places on the continent, still thinks, yeah, we probably need somebody to care about the people no one gives a damn about. I'm glad this church is doing that. And so as Grandview, here's another thing they did. They walked with refugees through getting permission to stay in Canada, and they noticed that refugees had trouble understanding the legal system. Anyone else notice this? So they designed a pamphlet that said, here's what will happen to you in court. Step one, this. This person will say this thing to you. This is what will happen next. They translated it into all the languages of the refugees they were serving. The province of British Columbia, one of the most secular governments on our continent, came to this little Baptist church and said, can we buy the pamphlet from you and use it for everybody? It's amazing what you can do ministering at a small level, refugees in Vancouver, and have a huge impact. The premier calls you up and asks for your help. That's weird, right? I know that's a little bit of the Anglican dream in life, but it happened for these Baptists. I'm sorry. And all the while, Tim, who's not that great a preacher, would preach with N.T. Wright in one hand. Wright talks about Christianity as the rapture in reverse. If the rapture is all of God's people getting beamed out, actual Christianity is all of God's people getting beamed in to a neighborhood where God loves those whom nobody else loves. On the other hand, he would preach with John Perkins from next door here in Mississippi. Christian community development, right? Investing in places no one wants to invest in to make money. And it's worked. So the story I love about Grandview Calvary in East Van is a visitor was coming to this church, and they asked two guys on the street corner, where's Grandview Calvary Church? And they said, yeah, it's right over here. You're in the right place. And he said, do you go to that church? Oh, I would never go to a Christian church. But if I did, it would be that one. All right, my last story is one that I'm a participant in, awkwardly. And it's also got a point in it that Matt and I hammer in our book about 8 virtues. Church plants are not by solo individuals. And so I want to suggest to you what really starts new experiments in church is creative friendship. It's creative friendship. So I was sent to pastor a multi-site church in a university town in North Carolina. We had 1,300 members, $1.4 million budget. A lot of that work isn't leadership. It's just management. It's just keeping the ship going, responding to crises, plugging holes, even preaching weekly and checking email and trying to not get fired. You can feel like you're doing the job if that's all you accomplish. That's not the job. Just keeping the machine going. The job is to get out there. The trick is that churches don't grow with passivity. The kingdom doesn't break in further because you're keeping up on your email. So I met with a man who visited. He was in ministry with Campus Crusade for Christ on our university campus, a lot more conservative than my Methodist bunch. But I cared about campus ministry, and his was growing. And his family needed a place to worship. So we met, swapped a few stories, grew toward creative friendship, sort of like John Lewis's Good Trouble. Now, creative friends tend to come from one circle beyond your current network. I tried to say some of this yesterday. I think of the church as sort of concentric circles. You got your keeners at the middle, the people who are always there, the people who like have survived you and survived 10 previous ministers, and they don't care if you're good or bad or not, right? And then right after them, you got people who sort of come sometimes, and those are the ones who are. And then after them, you've got people who you kind of know because they turn up once in a while. After them, you got people who won't come, but they might if someone goes and invites them and picks them up and tells them they think that they could find a home here. That's the circumference you want to get to. Not so many circles away, they'll never come. But just beyond your current border, that's where you want to spend more of your time. The temptation is the machine wants you to spend time in the middle. You got to tell those people, no, y'all going to pay my salary so I can ignore you. My job is to leave y'all to yourselves, and I'm going to go out here to the people no one's talking to. That's the shepherd leaves that, you get all those stories there. Okay, all right. So, one circle outside your current one. Creative friendship is born in similarity and difference, overlap. So evolutionary science says that ecosystems overlap is where new species arise. If you've got this kind of ecosystem and this kind of ecosystem on top of each other at the edges, that's where new life comes from. You got to get to the edges. That's where new life will come. So we're talking about Boone, and I learned that he's a trail builder and a climber. And he said this thing. He said, you know what some church really needs to do here in Boone? Build a trail up Howard's Knob. This is the mountain right behind my church. I had learned the previous night our church owned that property. And nothing could be built on it for commercial purposes. There was a conservation easement, but a trail could be built. Suddenly, we had a missional partnership. The church had the land, and we could do the legal due diligence to have volunteers working on it. We had all that capacity. Eric, as a campus minister, had willing volunteers who suddenly were on our land getting sweaty together and inviting their friends. They didn't have to say, hey, come to church, or hey, come to Campus Crusade. They could say, hey, come build a trail. That's Boone's love language, trail building. And they could talk about Jesus to their friend after 4 hours of getting sweaty together. That's Campus Crusade's dream. So I think that was leadership, quietly going and having 100 coffees, and one of them yields this fruit that you didn't expect. But I think, look how different it is than what we normally associate with leadership. There were no speeches involved, none of the microphone stuff. I did go to a meeting of my church trustees and manage not to fall asleep, which was pretty good on my part. I was on the lookout not just for new members, but for creative friendships, co-conspirators with whom to bless our town. And Eric was too. He had seen farther than I had what Boone needed. He knew climbers, and that climbers had no sense that churches did anything useful other than making them feel guilty for wanting to be outdoors. So he figured the trail would go up the mountain some other way. He had no idea we had a way to build his dream. Now, we almost fumbled it because the trustees got nervous about the legalities. What if somebody injures themselves? Do we need to open and close the thing? The lawyers are nervous. My trustee chair finally said, look, I drank a lot of beer in college. One thing I never did was carry it up a mountain first. We are not going to have kids carrying beer up our trail. You get the point? I never thought my trustee chair's drinking history would be a win for the mission of the church. Game, set, match for the trail. So the Boone United Trail was one of the ventures I was proudest of in ministry. Apparently, if you look at a heat map of the town of Boone from space, it's one of the most traveled places in the entire county. And the man I launched it with, Eric Heaston, still with crew, is one of my closest friends. Now, our church was a mainline, tall steeple type, full of lawyers and other white collars. There are good things there, but there's also temptation in Christendom. Church can be about getting seen, being noticed for being religious. That can be good for your career. That's kind of how you can tell what Christendom is. If you want to be seen at church, because it's good for your business, you're still in Christendom. In BC, you don't want to be seen in church. You go on the QT because it's bad for business. It's just ministry either way, but it's different. You can't dismantle Christendom if it's what you're in. You have to receive it as a gift. So my church had plenty of the worship wars. We stretched past the organ and the choir in the early 90s for a really stuffy contemporary service. By the time I got there, that was the biggest one. All the baby boomers went to the contemporary service, and it was pretty good. But then a group of millennials wanted to start a louder guitar service in the gym. So they started a super contemporary service, which is also typical. When I was there, we took a dying rural church under our wing and relaunched the thing. And then by the time I was there, we were also talking about a series of fresh expressions for those farther from the church. Here's what I realized. Our church had planted 3 churches, but they never talked about themselves as a planting church. You see that? They were all action and no talk, which is better than the reverse. They had planted the contemporary service. They had planted the super contemporary service. They had replanted the rural church service. They're good at that. And so my hearing their story and giving it back to them and saying, you guys are actually practiced at church planting. Let's do it again. Suddenly it wasn't starting something we had never started before. It was, about every 10 years we start a new service. It's time to do that again. That's one thing you do in leadership. You receive their story, and then you give it back to them in a way they hadn't heard it, but in a way that allows them to say, you're right. That is what we do. If you give the story back to them in a way that makes them say, nah, that's nonsense. It doesn't work. But you have to give it back to them in a way that goads them to a further challenge. My rabbi colleague at Byassee used to say the same thing as me on this. When you're starting something new, hug the tradition tighter. When you're starting something new, hug the tradition tighter. You don't say, we've never done this before. You say, we have always done this thing kind of like this. Now, we will do that same thing in a new way again. Or you can just say, we're starting a new tradition. In other words, tradition and innovation are not opposed to one another. What we're after is what Greg Jones calls traditioned innovation. Traditioned innovation. We're reaching back into our heritage for something fresh, for a new moment. All right, I'm about done. When I hear stories like this at conferences like this, I think, okay, enough superstar stories already. You don't know how bad my place is. Well, that's what my friend Tim thought in Vancouver. Garbage up to the roof and a vote to close. I worry about churches that think they have a future and they have it plotted and they know exactly how it's going to work. What do they need the resurrection for? Churches that don't think they have a future, I think, perfect. You're right where God wants you. Your only hope is the resurrection of a crucified rabbi, which is the only hope the church has ever really had in the first place. Leighton Ford, the great evangelist, says that God is an artist. God does originals, not copies. Now, I've sped you through a gallery of art here, not because I want you to copy any of them, but because I want you to be inspired in your own art by something you've seen here to design something none of them could have imagined. All right, I'm done. Questions, observations, responses, amendments to the minutes. What do you think? They told me I had 45 minutes. I took 43. But the session has 8 more minutes, so we got a moment. Please. I'll repeat your question if I need to. Yeah, go ahead, Bailey.
Thank you. Oh, there it goes. I really like what you said about how church is hyper-localized, and it's all about the community that you built in the space around you.
Right.
In a growing modern world with mega churches like the Highlands that have a pastor in one city preaching to people all across the country, how do we maintain our local spirit? How do we keep each other accountable and take care of each other? Yeah,
so is this going to be the ultimate nerdy answer or what? I have a book on that. So I wrote a book with a former student named Andrea Irwin called Following, Embodied Discipleship in a Digital Age. One thing about the internet is it wants to be placeless. It's the whole goal of the internet, to pull all the roots out. Ironically, I don't think you can fight it, right? More of you guys have been on the internet during my talk than have not been. And I could shame you for that and make you feel bad, but I just do the same thing too, right? So I think what churches have to do, the internet, if you like, there's an early church heresy called Gnosticism that denies the goodness of the body, the goodness of creation, the goodness of sexuality, and says we should just be spirits and get away from all that. The internet is a Gnostic heresy. It wants to get us away from the local, away from the embodied, away from the particular. What you have to do is use this disembodied medium for embodied ends. You can't fight it, it's already won. But you have to use it to say, look at our local and how beautiful it is. So whoever's doing these pilgrimage trails in Alabama with the martyrs is definitely advertising them on the internet, using the internet to enhance the experience, but it's driving it towards something local. So you can't use the internet to act like, well, we're really just an English cathedral here in Alabama. Like, no, you're not, and quit pretending. You have to love your specific place, even with this disembodied medium. That's how I think about that. So. Here's the other danger with all our Zoom services. We're all church planners now because we all had to plant on Zoom. Is we'll leave it where it was a year and a half ago and never change it. Because churches are really good at starting something and then just kind of keeping it running forever. Don't do that. Change it. See what's working now that wasn't working a year and a half ago and double down on that, right? So, who else?
Anybody else?
Only people in the front 2 rows have questions. The keeners sit in the front, apparently.
My name's Ricky Browning from St. Stephen's, Huntsville. I wasn't here yesterday afternoon, but I did hear your speech, so I'm going to tie that with something you said today.
Thank you.
Kate Walsh sat in her church as just the guitar while she had all of these capabilities, and you mentioned that you need to know your place in a granular level. So how do you marry those two?
Yeah. I really worry about kind of pronouncements from on high, right? This is one reason I think Anglicanism in all its beauty is better than the Roman Catholic Church in all its beauty. The Pope speaks kind of for the whole planet, and that's great in its own way. In Anglicanism, no diocese is more important than any other diocese. Ministry happens.
Except here.
Except the Diocese of Alabama. So, you in Alabama wouldn't try and say, all over the world, ministry should just look exactly like this. You're actually able, in your structure, to be attentive to the local. And then another place, attentive to its local, can learn from you guys. So I actually think y'all are well placed, both to love the particular and to have some relationship that's beyond that. There was a hand over here, I think. Somebody was, nope. Oh, it was a pointing. Here we are.
Here we are. Tom.
My name's Tom Osborne, and I'm a deacon in this diocese. We've had deacons in this diocese for 20 years. Before that, we had a whole series of bishops who didn't want deacons, permanent deacons.
Right.
This man right here was the leader of the group that formed me into a deacon. When you were talking about tradition and innovation,
Right.
Maybe you did this on purpose, but you know the theme of this meeting is supposed to be
the deep roots and new growth.
New growth.
Yeah.
It just struck me when you were making circles in the air.
Yeah.
About
I didn't have slides today,
who
so I had
are already in, and those who are just on the outside, and so forth. Bill King, this guy over here, affected my life. When he talked about what the deacon was as opposed to the priest. He said, think of a circle.
Yeah.
The priest is in the center of the circle.
Deacon goes out.
The deacon is on the circumference and goes back and forth.
That's good. So in your language then, what I'm trying to say is that priests have to be more like deacons rather than the reverse.
Well, no, that's not, that was not my point.
I know.
Maybe yours. My point was that a diocese like this that now has 20 years of experience with deacons can use deacons to do a lot of what you're talking about.
Please do. So
they
one
shouldn't
thing,
just let us serve in the parish on Sundays. Right?
That's great.
Make use of us out there.
One thing I got from evangelicals is this. I spent a lot of time with InterVarsity. I spent a lot of time with Young Life. And what they're really good at is noticing who in the room no one's talking to and going and loving that person. That's the person Jesus is working on. I just find mainline churches tend not to have that same kind of instinct. And I think some of it for evangelicals is because they really are worried about people going to hell. That motivates them. I'm not saying be motivated by that. Find some other reason to be motivated. Use Jesus' resurrection, the Imago Dei. I don't care what it is, but go find them and love them. They're the person someone's bringing. Another edge person, find the artists in your community. They're probably not in your church yet, but they want to create beauty. And your church is the kind of place that wants to display beauty. And artists often have an eye for, well, if you did this and moved this and I did a commission, then it could, that's the kind of eye you want on your place from the outside. I feel Bishop Blooming here. I'm going to leave you with one story. I got to interview Andrew Walls. Andrew Walls is a great mission theologian, missiologist from Scotland. He's just died. And he likes to say Christianity seems to be the kind of religion that dies in the middle and renews itself at the edges. Islam doesn't do that. Islam tends to homogenize culture. Christianity, we renew at the edges by giving our faith away, translating the Bible into new languages, becoming enculturated into new cultures. So if you want to live, go to the edges where the Holy Spirit is creating new trouble. He says this is a global scale, and he can show it. I found it hugely helpful for my parish ministry. I got to get to the edges and then report back to the middle what's happening at the edges. And that's what my preaching was. Hey, I was in our community. There's somebody who will never come to our church, but they say, you know what a church ought to do? That was gold for my preaching. Walls also says this cool thing. He says he grew up in Glasgow in Scotland. Of the 4 great downtown cathedral churches in Glasgow, 3 are now nightclubs. 3 of them make great nightclubs, that medieval space. The 4th is an African immigrant church that's booming and asking itself questions like, how do we reach all these lonely old white people in our neighborhood?